Hello everyone and welcome back to Reading Reddit, the channel where I read you popular and obscure stories from the hive mind of the internet while you do other things. I'm your host Damien, and without further ado, let's begin. When it comes to giant diesel tanks, empty is relative. Life lessons with a cutting torch. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. John and Randy were in the tiny 8-space parking lot across the alley when I woke up. My apartment up on the 3rd floor had a pair of giant double doors that opened out over the alley. Directly across from me was the Wealthy Street overpass. It was the noise that got me curious, the clanking and creaking of something large and metallic. I slowly crawled out of bed, opened the doors to look down. That's when I saw those two laughing assholes had somehow managed to fit what looked like half a lunar rocket onto a 20-foot trailer. It was huge. It looked like a grain silo or something, laying on its side, and far too big for that old, beat-up trailer. It was every bit of 30 feet long and over 10 feet in diameter. It was restrained with a combination of rusty old tow chains and wooden blocks, perched precariously on the trailer, and covered in patches of dried mud. The whole thing had a diamond plate texture, like the front bumper on a fire truck, and it had a couple of pipes sticking out from the side near either end. My first thought was, I am not awake enough for this shit. But it was a beautiful summer day, and I left the doors open while I made breakfast. I sat cross-legged on the edge of the floor, eating my strawberry instant oatmeal, and watched those two geniuses form a plan. Everyone loves hard work. We can watch it all day. It turned out, it was an old underground storage tank that had once held diesel, and lots of it. This one had held about 20,000 gallons of liquid sunshine at some point. I don't know where he got it, but Randy was a skilled scrapper, and his mission was to cut this giant tube into pieces and haul it in for scrap metal for pennies on the pound. Because of reasons that I'm sure made for one hell of a story, the scrapyard won't accept an intact tank. The onus is on the seller to carve it into pieces and bring it in as plates of metal. So these two had a day ahead of them with a cutting torch. A giant steel tank placed precariously on half of a rotten old flatbed trailer. Questionable tools, and no idea what the hell they were doing. Come with me, and we'll be in a world of OSHA violations. The thing about the word empty is that it's a relative term. Outside of a physics lab, empty is pretty much an impossible thing to actually create. An empty glass of water is filled with nearly 15 pounds per square inch of air. When your gas tank is empty, it still has enough fuel in there to completely torch your car. Firefighters get very tense about an empty fuel oil tank in your basement because it's more of an explosion hazard than a full one. Well, that day we all learned that an empty 20,000 gallon diesel tank can have about 50 gallons of sludgy, sticky diesel sitting on the bottom, and you won't even notice it. That is, until the moment some fucking lunatic starts carving the damn thing apart with a cutting torch. I was half certain it was going to explode the moment they went at it with a torch, so I found somewhere else to be for a while, on the other side of as many thick brick walls as possible. I went and accomplished my morning office work and came back to check on them from time to time. The fire had started almost immediately, but it was small and manageable. They had started cutting on one end, and the small amount of diesel inside had ignited. When you look inside the tank, there was only a small strip of liquid, maybe 6 inches wide at the most, running the length of the bottom of the tank. It widened out to maybe 1.5 feet wide at one end, and only a few inches at the other. It was empty. They figured it would burn, but not for very long, and not very big or anything. It would just burn off in a few minutes and they'd go on with their day. This, however, turned out to be very, very wrong. John, being the artist that he was, cut a pair of giant eye holes, a nose, and a mouth at the end of the tank. A 10-foot jack-o'-lantern with flames shooting out. I have to admit, it did look pretty badass. The problem was, the fire wasn't going down. It was getting bigger. But it was all inside the tank. So while we were a bit concerned, it wasn't terribly dangerous. The tank, however, was starting to glow a dull red, and that was concerning. It was too hot to work on. Hell, it was too hot to stand within a dozen feet of it. The great iron beast was radiating enough heat that we were concerned that the tires on the trailer would melt. I was standing 2 stories above it, and it was uncomfortable. There wasn't much smoke, thankfully, but the heat was immense. My apartment had an asphalt floor. A century before I lived there, that room had held thousands of barrels of beer. The weight of the barrels and the heat of the summer combined to leave the entire floor of my apartment an intricate pattern of deeply inset circles and rings about half an inch deep. I had painted the entire floor in gigantic black and white 3-foot checkerboard squares. It looked incredible, but was a bitch to clean. Because of that, hanging on the wall of my bathroom, just under the sink, was one of those plastic hose reels that suburbanites put on the back of their house. I turned on the water, grabbed the hose, and marched to the double doors. Standing at the edge of my 3rd floor double doors, I pulled the trigger and let loose a long streaming arc of cold, clear water down upon that tank. I was a man with a plan. I had used a tool to solve a problem and save the day. Standing there, hose in hand, on top of the world, I was a happy guy. Calm, under pressure, and solving the problem. Everything was right in the world. Right up until the second the water hit the tank. That moment. That was the exact moment when shit really went sideways. Now, I've seen rain on the lid of a charcoal grill. I've seen a drop of water on a skillet. I had a reasonable expectation of the events to follow. The problem is that 50 gallons of burning diesel has a hell of a lot more energy than a charcoal grill. And when it's been pumping heat into a few tons of steel for over an hour, it has a hell of a lot more thermal mass than a skillet. From a physics standpoint, I was pissing in the wind. The moment the water reached the red-hot tank, it instantly flashed into steam. The thing about steam is that a very small amount of water turns into a gigantic volume of steam. I filled up the alley with a cloud in seconds. Within a few moments, I couldn't even see the tank at all. I could still aim easily though. The hose made a very distinct sound when the water was hitting the tank. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the sound that nature makes to tell you that you've seriously fucked up. The cloud continued to grow. It was up over the roof, filling the alley, spilling over the wealthy street overpass. Cars slowed to a crawl, and everyone turned to watch. We created a traffic jam on 3 different streets as a plume of thick white steam went everywhere. I turned off the hose. The many ways that I was going to catch hell for this immediately jumped through my head. I wanted to try and not have fire trucks and cop cars lingering in the street. They won't care whose fault it is. It's going to be my ass first, and they'll chew their way down to everyone else. Randy was a passionate devotee of recreational pharmaceuticals, and didn't even have a driver's license. I'm sure he also didn't have many of the other things he'd need to explain how he was hauling that much weight on too small of a trailer on city streets. He was also, at any given moment, as high as giraffe pussy. I didn't want to exacerbate the situation and destroy this guy's life. It was already a pretty shitty life to begin with. For one thing, his trailer was on fire. Though lots of very quick shouting from these guys on the ground to me in the air saying words like, "You fucking idiot," was conveyed with the hose that was not going to work. We cooled it off a lot, but the fire was still burning. We were sitting in the middle of downtown. We couldn't just leave it burning there. Randy had decided the best idea was to move it somewhere else, where it could just burn off and not get too much attention. He got in his dilapidated truck and started off up the alley when the next round of screaming started. At least this time it wasn't me. It was John. John's mouth was spitting fire. Literally. The mouth he had carved near the bottom of the tank was fine when it was sitting at rest. But once the tank started moving, the diesel inside sloshed around and came spitting and dripping out. On its own, that was a bad thing. Dripping a trail of diesel on the ground is generally frowned upon. Even back in the 90s, before the world was anywhere near as green a place as it is today. The fact that this particular diesel fuel was on fire is what made the situation that much worse. Randy got out of the truck, sitting there, idling in the alley, gave the whole situation one long look as both of his remaining brain cells fought for control, and said, "Fuck it." With a 1,000-yard stare of a man who had completely used up his last fuck to give, He climbed back into that jolly green giant of a truck, turned downhill facing Iona Street, and drove away, dripping liquid fire on every bump. Now, when he came to the corner of the alley in Iona Street, he had to make a decision. Going left, he would pass a fire station in a couple of blocks, and I'm sure they'd want to have a chat with him if he drove down and they saw him. Turning right, and he'd have to go through the city's center, the heart of downtown, with stoplights, traffic, and tall buildings. I never know what he chose, because once I saw what he was doing and realized just how stupid it was, I got the hell out of there and went as far away as I could get in the other direction. The last thing I saw of that shit show was the back of that tank carved up like a giant pumpkin, spitting fire and scaring the living shit out of anyone unlucky enough to end up behind them in traffic, driving away down the alley. Just another day in the city. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, please give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to thank everyone who posted their stories to the subreddit. You can visit them at the links in the description below. If you missed the last video, you have to go check it out. Links are also in the description. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.